Hello, everyone. What I want to talk to you today, very humbly, because this is a new topic. It was a new topic for me. I wasn't working on migration before this project. It was a little bit challenging in the beginning. And I understand this as an ongoing project. And so it's not completely completed yet. Like the project is not completely completed. Yes, but work in progress. So what I want to talk to you a little bit today is different aspects of my involvement with the ITHACA project, looking at mainstream media, but also looking at alternative media, and also the work with the Super Archive, and trying to collect these narratives of Sub-Saharan women migrants in Morocco. So because this was a new topic, but I wasn't a blank page, I came from somewhere. So I thought in the beginning, what are the links between the previous work that I had done, and how could I embark on this new topic, but still carry on some of the traces of my identity as a researcher. And so for me, the continuation was in terms of continuing to look at gender studies, continuing to do a media analysis of mainstream media, but also alternative media, with a particular focus on this intersection between migration media and gender. My particular standpoint, so it's something that I believe in as a feminist media scholar, is that one has to acknowledge where they come from. And for me, I had been studying before this project my own people, quote unquote, right? And all of a sudden I'm studying something else, right? So I'm looking at Sub-Saharan women migrants in a privileged position here in Morocco as a Moroccan citizen. And I think this is important to completely acknowledge where we come from, and to keep that in mind as we are dealing with that project. So the fact that I have this privilege that the participants of my study don't have. So I was focusing on women's migration journey, because of course the migration journey, as you all know, exceeds the domains of race and social class and religion. It is very much gendered as well. So I was interested in pulling out how do women's experiences differ from those of men in their migration journey. So this presentation for me, I'll talk to you about the research process and the procedures that I've embarked upon. And you will see some of my findings, but I won't spend too much time talking about the findings just because of time constraints. But I'm happy to go back to that in the discussion period if there is interest, because I understand that what we're trying to share here is methodological insights, right, today. This is the outline of what I will discuss today. I'll talk a little bit about the conceptual framework, the lit review, contextualizing this topic because it's important for my approach, which is textual analysis. I'll share with you some of the results. I'll talk about the policy council that dealt with media, and I will talk about social media narratives, and I will end with collecting sources for the Super Archive, our common project. So what was on the back of my mind is this, and what I've used continuously in this project is this: cultural studies, post-colonial theory, critical race studies, gender studies. All of these were very useful to me as a theoretical framework. And the question of representation is my starting point. So it's very interesting to me to hear about truth, because for me, I was interested as a communication studies person in the idea of representation, right? So what is represented in the media as not the truth, but as a portrayal, as an image, as something that is constructed, that is created. And I go back to the work of Stuart Hall for that. But at the same time as I say this, also in communication studies, we also believe in the importance of the truth, ironically. So that the truth is also important For instance, in journalism, what is truth in journalism as something that needs to be established for any democratic system, or an aspiring democratic system to function. We need to know what is going on, and there's a truth. And even in post-colonial theory, we talk about speaking truth to power, right? So there is a truth, there's a particular reality of, like you've mentioned, the subalterns, Spivak's work, etc. So these are lived realities, they're not fabrications. So there's something as a lie, something that is fabricated, and what is embodied, right? What is experienced, what seems to be the truth for someone. So the starting point is this notion of representation, and for me, Stuart Hall is very useful. Representation as the language and images created to provide conceptual maps of the world and create culture. So my question was, how are they represented in mainstream media? And how do they in turn represent themselves? Self-representation, right? So those two aspects, which I've been looking at in my path, in my journey as a researcher for different topics, not just this topic dealing with Sub-Saharan migration. So reviewing the literature, this might seem basic, but with my research assistants, throughout the different semesters, we looked at it in different languages. So I would tell them, look at it in Arabic, French, and English. What has been published on this topic, right? So looking at this in different languages, looking at this through the library databases, but also just Google, using lots of different keywords, playing with keywords. I did that as well for the textual analysis to extract my data, to make sure that we don't miss anything. And also following the lead of reference sections of scholarly articles, looking at who did they cite, and go into those sources as well to compile my review of literature, and also exchanging and sharing resources with Catherine. We exchange our reviews of literature, our sources. What did you find? What did you find? So this is also very useful. There was a lot of checking, double checking, triple checking, quadruple checking, etc., to make sure we didn't miss anything. And that's also for my data collection, right? For the super archive, to make sure, are we missing something important? What's happening? And it never ends. So to check again, maybe to continue checking again. We were done with the super archive, and Catherine found something, a really interesting source. And she said, did you put it in the super archive? And I said, no, I didn't know about it. And when do we stop, right? So apparently there's still an opportunity to add something, but at some point, the job of the researcher is to stop and write and conclude and make some conclusions, even though this is still ongoing. So for my review of the literature that I understand as a synthesis, for me, a review of the literature is a synthesis. It's storytelling, right? So we're telling a story, it's not a summary. And so the two themes that I looked at are really media and gender, right? So these are the two sections of my literature review, the two main sections of my literature review. Looking at the gender dimension, there are a lot of studies, not a lot, but some studies, it's actually quite limited, but they're looking at gender from an anthropological perspective or from a sociological perspective, but they're not looking at the media dimension. So I also wanted to look at the very few communication and media studies on the topic, and those studies are not looking at the gender dimension, right? So trying to bring these together, they're both an under-studied areas. So very few studies that show basically a media representation of Sub-Saharan migrants in Morocco, I'm citing them here, that they're portrayed negatively. There's limited mainstream media coverage. We're not surprised to see this. There's one study on self-representation. It's the only study that I could find, but it's not so much focusing on alternative media. It particularly focuses on young men's counter discourses, so not women. It's focused on men. And the other one by Inneji and Bignamo focuses on some migrants' use of smartphones and social media in Fez. So not so much media that is used in the public domain, which is what I've been interested in. For gender and migration, there are several studies, and these are the dominant themes that I extracted in the Moroccan context when it comes to Sub-Saharan migrants, sex work and domestic work. I'll go very fast. If there's anything that you want me to elaborate on, Q&A period. but I have too much content. And domestic work, the theme of motherhood, and also bringing back the lit review when I was doing the analysis. So for instance, the theme of motherhood was absent, right? In the news analysis that I conducted, I looked at His Press, which is the leading online news site in Morocco, and I was also looking at social media narratives. Gender-based violence, GBV, as a dominant theme, right, in the literature that would come up in the migration journey, and also in Morocco as something that severely impacts the trajectories of women. And these are they're not supposed to be migrants, but they should be listed as refugees because gender persecution is within the scope of the 1951 UNHCR Refugee Convention. So that was also something interesting that came out from my own analysis, is these lines that are very blurred between migrant status and refugee status, and when some people who qualify as refugees are still listed as migrants, or still themselves consider themselves as migrants, right? Which is so don't even see that they could be qualified for refugee status. So I was part of textual analysis. I used Bainbridge. I'll talk about this methodology a little bit later. But part of it is to collect background information, because a media text does not exist in a vacuum. This could be a media text. It doesn't. So what is the context? So part of the other task was with my research assistants. What are the facts? Let's collect facts, including statistics. I was very interested in numbers. What are the statistics? Reports from civil society about discrimination, about racism, etc., to give the background. What's the legal context? What's the social political context? And these were the sources: news articles, scholarly articles, statistics, and websites and reports from civil society. Okay, so these are some main facts that I gathered about the Moroccan context. So it's a little bit weird for me to focus so much on the process and just move on from the essence of what I'm saying, right? But some of the context is right here. So for instance, in Morocco, there was a migration policy that was enacted in 2013. There's a national strategy for migration and asylum. This is really the bigger context. 2 regularization campaigns in Morocco. There haven't been regularization campaigns since then. And there is discrimination. There's a gap in implementing the state policy, lack of knowledge about it, lack of implementation, etc. And there's reports about discrimination, the very vibrant role that civil society plays, and also religious humanitarianism, important role in providing support to migrants in Morocco. But also, one very interesting study that I read was by Teisler that talked about the religious humanitarianism, and for me that just questions the entire idea of benevolence, the benevolence of humanitarian work, also talking about the work of Doctors Without Borders in the forest in Morocco. So to contextualize all of this, maybe because within me there's a little bit of a structuralist, although every time I think about Foucault I have to think about the fact that he was a sexual predator. Okay, and I have to mention that I love the ideas, but I cannot forget what he did to North African boys. So as a structuralist, the context, right? The context really matters. So what is the role that civil society plays and religious humanitarianism plays, etc., within the migration industry? Okay. So I used Bainbridge textual analysis in my life as a researcher. I've used content analysis, critical discourse analysis, different ways of studying text. And textual analysis is what I've been using now. I think that CDA is very appropriate, content analysis is very appropriate in other contexts, but I like textual analysis. And I use these 2 concepts called exnomination and structuring absences. And throughout I would include the context. So exnomination is basically the main themes. So this is thematic analysis, right? So looking at the main themes, because repetition is always meaningful, right? So if it's a dominant theme that is repeated in the news, it matters, right? A dominant image that keeps coming back. And I think we do thematic analysis for interviews, focus groups, for analysis of text, etc. So it's very common that us as researchers, okay, what are the main themes? What's happening? And the structuring absences is the other concept, and it deals with what is missing. He's not the only one who has said that. For instance, Stuart Hall talked about what is missing in a representation is just as important as what is there. So one has to look at, here's the framing theory, also framing analysis. Here's my frame, here's my news article. It says this, right? What's outside of the frame, right? What is not there? Who hasn't been interviewed? Who wasn't quoted? Who wasn't, what issues were not talked about? Okay. So I selected these case studies, like I said, because his Presse is the leading site for online news, and Planète Migrants as an object of analysis. It's a web TV on YouTube, web series on YouTube, because I wanted a long-term intervention. I wanted enough content to analyze, and because of the notion of self-representation. I also plan on doing some interviews, which I didn't get a chance to do, and I have to do one next week, hopefully. And other forms of data collection, the policy councils and the super archive. So I have a lot of sources in the super archive, but because I was doing an in-depth qualitative analysis, I can't analyze everything. But there are different things that are there, blog, etc., magazine, blah, blah, blah. They could be analyzed, but there's only so much that we can do. The report to me, and I talked to Catherine about this, if there's an opportunity, it could be the report that we did on communication and COVID-19 and all of that for the Policy Council, the first one. That could be a study, really, because it could be easily published, and there's so much rich data. Those were like sort of focus groups that we had, and the findings are amazing. And I was thinking beyond utilizing them for just writing the report, they could be utilized to publish a study, because it's so rich, right? So the data that we generated from the policy councils. Okay, so his Presse as the leading site. So I had to prove that it's the leading site. So that was also something that I checked, not just with the analytics, but also other studies that say that his Presse is the leading online site. Why am I looking at this to justify this? And again, to extract the story about Sub-Saharan migrant women, I was only interested in women. I'm not interested in men. I was only interested in stories about women. So, and we had to do multiple searches, because I'm a little bit, I don't know, paranoid is not the right word, but did we not miss anything? So multiple searches to try to make sure, do I have all the articles? Do I have all the news articles? Let's play with the keywords. Let's use other keywords, etc. We did this with his Presse Arabic and his Presse French, because there's a French version and there's an Arabic version. And then I analyzed all of them. There wasn't so many, by the way. This is not a topic that is really covered. And the key figures, like in the literature, the sex worker, stories about Sub-Saharan migrant women as sex workers, cyber prostitution, stories about cyber prostitution, stories about GBV, so just like the literature, stories about rape, human trafficking, showing women's vulnerability. And I wondered, is it portraying them as victims, right? Because that's all, this whole side of it. And it intersects with discrimination, so I'll skip. So, and I thought that the coverage was ambiguous, because on one hand it's very racist. I like that sometimes we just say things plainly, because very often academic language making things complicated, right? When it doesn't need to be. At the core of this is effing racism, okay? So this is what's at the core of this is, I'm being recorded? I said the bad word. Well, just the first letter. So just the racism. So at the core of this is what it is. And that's why the coverage is ambiguous. Sometimes it's like, oh, these poor women, they're victims, blah, blah, blah. But at the other time, it's also reinforcing racism, stereotyping. There was an op-ed, I couldn't believe that it was published. There was an op-ed by an expert writing how it's better to marry a Moroccan woman than a Sub-Saharan woman, right? I mean, some really, really obvious, blatant racism. This op-ed described Black women as not pretty, not good spouses. This is the op-ed that I'm referring to. And criminalization. So my critical race studies showed me, for Muslim representation, how Muslims were portrayed in, Canadian news, American news. That's something that I looked at before. So there would be an association between the Arab terrorists, right, etc., the Muslim, blah, blah, blah. But so when is it that ethnicity or religion is mentioned? So there were studies about that, for instance, in the Canadian press. Yasmin Jiwani did studies about that. Well, when is it that religion becomes mentioned, or ethnicity becomes? So comparative analysis to show, well, you don't need to mention religion, right? And when it was white perpetrators, they would show them as mentally ill. All of a sudden, mental illness becomes the trope to introduce acts of terror, etc. Okay. So what happened? We don't understand what happened here. What's the situation? How come this white boy committed an act of terror? They don't use the word act of terror, right? So there's mental illness framework that comes. So here, criminalization in the Moroccan press. Why would you even mention that they're Sub-Saharan when we're talking about fraud and theft? And you wouldn't mention it if they were Moroccan, right? You wouldn't mention their religion in the Moroccan press when you associate them with criminalization. Like, how does that fact become relevant? So I wanted to look at alternative media, and I'm very interested in what some of you said about impact, because I don't have answers for impact, and impact is so important. So for instance, the other project that said, they're looking at impact on the individual, I have no idea how they measure this. Okay, so maybe by doing surveys, but impact is so important. So when I'm looking at the media, what is the impact? And for me, it has very low impact because of the number of views and shares and likes, and that's something that I'll talk about in a moment. So why the need for alternative media as non-state, non-corporate media? I'm not going to spend too much time saying what is alternative media, or why do we need alternative media, right? So in this particular situation, to tell a different type of story about Sub-Saharan migrants, and so that they can tell their own stories in their own voice with their own frames, etc. So the Policy Council, we presented this a while back, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. I won't talk about it, but these are some really interesting insights that are very much rich data that would make a great study for this. So how is it that they view the media? There's indifference towards the fate of migrants. I think they're quite correct. I found very few news articles about that. So they're correct that this is not a top priority. It's not a topic that occupies, center stage, that they're portrayed as violent disease carriers, etc. So all of this is really interesting. They talked about this cover. If you remember, Catherine, when we did the Policy Council, they talked about this magazine cover, which really portrays them as responsible for coronavirus, for the coronavirus in Morocco. And so there are some really, really troubling framings that happen that must be denounced. This is an image from the first Policy Council that dealt with media. And I'm going to talk about social media narratives. So I was trying to see, again, I had no idea about this topic before, and I was trying to see, well, who's speaking in the public domain? Who are the voices out there? And trying to gather this information. And one of the questions that should be asked is, what are social media methodologies? How do we study social media? So are there different ways of studying social media? A lot of people do surveys, which is very classic, sort of like methodology. Textual analysis, which is what I did, what I ended up doing, and I'll explain why. So what we have to do is not justify what we did, but also justify what we didn't do. How come I didn't do these other methodologies? And I didn't do these other methodologies. Small stories research is a researcher invented this methodology to study social media, meaning that you look at the comments, right, as small stories, which is very different than analyzing, let's say, a novel as a story, because this is, emojis and, and people are applying, and the interactivity feature, and it's very, very different. Computer-mediated discourse analysis, digital discourse studies, ethnography, statistical analysis. Some people are looking at the structure, doing a Marxist political economy approach, image analysis. So within visual communication methods, there's so much. There are different methodologies to look at how to analyze images, right? So I didn't do those because of the low numbers. I didn't do an ethnography. I didn't do statistical analysis because these videos had very low numbers of views, shares. A lot of them, the comments were disabled, so there were no comments to analyze. So I ended up analyzing social media in a very traditional way, doing textual analysis, right? So just looking at the content, not looking at the interactivity, because there wasn't any interactivity to look at. But I also think that one of the reasons is because it's not really appealing. And if these were more professionally produced, they could be more appeal to them, and there could be more engagement. So why am I even studying this stuff? So I argue that small media is still worthy of academic inquiry because it carries through marginalized voices. So I ask myself, why do I study something that has 28 views, right? A video that has 28 views. What is the purpose? What is the point? Okay, so that would be my argument. So how I found these sources, there's a lack of sources. And of course, because everybody who shows their face, they're quote-unquote documented migrants. So that's also a gap in this type of research, that you don't find the voices of undocumented migrants because they're not going to post a video and say, here's what I think about this topic, and showing their face, etc. So it's with their name, etc. So these are stills from some of the videos that I analyzed from Planet Migrants. So the YouTube page is called Planet Migrants. And these are the 7 videos that I ended up analyzing. So there are more than that. But I only wanted the ones that were dealing with women, with Sub-Saharan women, right? And so significantly. So the videos were between, very short videos that were 4 minutes long to the longer one. I think the longest one was 31 minutes. Okay, 31 minutes long. So what were the themes? These are images. I'll just show you some images. This is a video about a successful woman entrepreneur in Rabat who has her own shop. So positive representation was a big part of it. Let's show Sub-Saharan migrants in a positive light. This is another video about 2 successful women entrepreneurs in Morocco. This is the video that shows the president of an association for Sub-Saharan migrants. That's another thing that I collected for the context, is how many associations exist in Morocco. And I was surprised that there are quite a few for the number. There are very few Sub-Saharan migrants in Morocco, and they're very active, very politicized, very aware. So the politicization of Sub-Saharan migrants in Morocco is really striking. So very quickly, these are the dominant themes. I'm not going to talk about it for too long because I'm out of time. But the dominant themes, the theme of integration was very surprising. They were talking about how they want to be integrated in Moroccan society. So that was it's not a transit country. We need our rights here, right? So this was really important. The focus on the ideal migrants. I won't bring in the literature, but very quickly, the focus on positive representation was there. And of course, I'm critical of it because it's still an essentialism, right? So let's just show the nice migrants. Talking about racism, the color line, because here it's really about color, about skin color. Politicization, I talking about discrimination in housing, in health, in employment, etc. And calling for dignity, right? The call for dignity as something that surfaced as being important. So sort of like human rights. This is an image from another video. This is an image from another video. See the sticker here, United Against Racism. What was absent? What was absent very quickly? The videos were in French. So Anglophone migrants not represented. The voices of undocumented migrants, very importantly, this is not represented. Not so much talk about the role of the Moroccan state. Okay, all the calls were about civil society should do this, civil society. So the style, very typical of alternative media, issues of style, poor sound quality, basic camera work, etc. So it should be more, there's an opportunity making the social media narratives more appealing to gain attention. What's the impact? You tell me. You help me think through this, please. So what is the impact of this stuff? So what? Very small numbers of views. Are we giving voice? not giving voice. Thank you. So doing this for, but they're calling for social political change. For the Super Archive, you ended up using their real names because these were public sources, and using public domain sources is different. So there is no, they already put their names there, out there, or at least their web identity. And so if you click on the link, you figure out who the person is. So different way of dealing with this. These are non-linear stories. So me and Jacopo exchanging emails. Where's the, what's the time? What's the place? I don't know. Okay, telling my research assistant, what's time one? What's place one? What's place two? And I'm telling them, rewatch the videos, try to guess, gather as much information. So we put what we could, but some columns are left without any information because this is not an interview. It's just, you know, sometimes you don't even know the citizenship of the person speaking, right? And you can't, okay. And does the story matter than the author? I've been thinking so far that it's the story that matters, right? So all those demographic details for me, they were not so something that I thought about as being very, very important. And that thought came from critical discourse analysis. Okay, these are some of the voices. This woman wrote a book called Impossible de Rester. She's one of the most vocal women here in Morocco. Impossible to Stay. Okay, it's a novel. And this is another woman who's a president of a Congolese community here. I'm done. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.